myself and for other people to see Afro-Boricuas. That is, when I was growing up, everybody who was Latino on television was olive skin at best, usually Mexican. Women were stereotyped as oversexed, with all this wild hair and these big earrings, and wearing red. To this day, I'm really careful about red. But one of our jobs as writers is to address that issue of stereotyping. And how do you address stereotyping? For the longest time, I didn't know how. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to talk about that. So, have at it.
Now, I think answering first, I want to offer
my It's a very interesting part of the conversation. And I think it's one of the missing parts of the conversation, which somewhat ties back into what Esther was talking before, this idea that some of us, for instance, maybe people like me from my group, may come, there is a privilege attached to that perception that people have. And yet, at the same time, you can be the Queen of England. You can have Elizabeth come here with her well and her crown and be in New York, and she will have many parties, and she will be displaced. She will no longer be the Queen of England. She will no longer mean the same here, even though people will defer to her, or a certain amount of people will. So while there is it's easier for some of us, it's easier because the door has been opened by who came. We stand on the shoulders of who came before us. The Italian community certainly did a wonderful job integrating themselves. There is also a component, which I call I learned once, I wrote an article about disenfranchised grief. You arrive, and maybe I'm going to talk about me, I'm Italian. I came with a good education. I came from not a poor family, not a wealthy family, a nice family, a normal family. My sister's a lawyer in Italy, and we had a lovely life. And people just don't think that people like me would have a hard time here. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And I think they're talking about people who experience difficulties, even if you were met at the airport with red roses, would possibly not just give justice to our experience, which in a way is almost betraying those of us who don't want to say it, as if there's something not good about it, as if you shouldn't be able to own your whole story. But it's also, I hope, it's not just seen as people who are, or it's not just the experience of the poor, it's the experience of the whole. Everybody is affected by it. So what I hope to contribute is to break that stereotype, which is sort of the reverse stereotype, that just because it's easier, that you don't have a difficulty. Yes, there is difficulty, and I hope that by seeing it up there, it's better understood when it's experienced by people who even have less needs. So we do need to change that perception.
As a fiction writer, I think we can bring the reader into the emotional and personal life of whatever group we identify with. And in doing so, the reader could ultimately say, oh, so they're not really like that. And I think the writer has the power of the pen to do that, to help erase the stereotype, excuse me, stereotype ideas that people may have about a certain group. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Now, Tiziana, since you have the microphone, your children are multicultural and multilingual. Do you feel that that richness was more difficult for them to absorb? Or do they feel by accepting one, they're betraying the other, or how does that work?
You mean in terms of taking in the Italian?
And then from your father's side, a whole other tradition.
That wasn't as much part of my experience. It was really more of a resistance, my son's resistance, because we live in an area where no one is Italian, almost, as you know. And so there was a resistance in that sense. It's interesting, and I'm happy now to see that on his Facebook page, he says that he was born in Perugia, where I'm from, and he was not born in Perugia. He was born in Lenox Hill, in New York. So somehow I must have conveyed something positive. There is pride that goes with experiencing what came before you, particularly if it's valued. How can you not? I mean, that's the bedrock where everything rests. So, you know, when Danielle was saying before, the importance of being who you are, keeping the wholeness of your identity and tradition, is a whole idea that you could come here to a different country, just forget what you were before. It's just impossible. As a human being, you can't do that. What are you going to build on? Which values are you going to leverage on if there's nothing that are allowed? So there wasn't as much conflict from that side. It just was his determination that Italian was not necessary.
And Tiziana, I love that your son's sort of revisionist history is recuperating Italy. That's great. I want to speak to this question as a Haitian. And I feel that it's really, really important, or I feel in my work, I do address stereotypes, both from the inside and from the outside. So in writing my own stories and making them complicated and nuanced, stories, by stories I mean poems and short stories and working on other genres, making them nuanced, making them represent who I am, what I think about. I think that's really important. But I also address the dominant narratives about Haiti. You know, often, and in particular, after the earthquake, there was, you would hear about Haiti. Haiti, the what? Poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. That was Haiti's last name, right? The poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Right? And so it was so troublesome to me that I thought that I should write a poem entitled something like Poem for the Poorest Country in the Western Hemisphere, which I did, right? And in it, I'm sort of flipping all the notions, right, of Haiti. Haiti with the flies, but Haiti also with the wonderful green mountains, Haiti with the troublesome and revolutionary history, Haiti with people who go to work every day, right? And kids who go to school every day, and people who work in banks, and so on. Right? So I felt it was really important to provide a narrative other than the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So I think that that's part of my job, and by writing new narratives and my own narratives, I create a space for Haitian American writers, or I participate in the creation of the space of Haitian and Haitian diasporic voices.